So, if there's one thing that I'd like you to take away from this presentation, it's the following proposition. And that is that standards can support generic, reusable and extensible integration when a solution needs to span multiple systems. But it's very important to understand that the strength of a standard is dependent on the adoption and the uptake of that standard. A standard that doesn't see widespread use is much like the proverbial tree, the sound of the tree falling in a forest when there's no one to hear it. And that means, and it's also important to understand that the standard has to be supporting clinical outcomes. The standard cannot be an end in itself. There needs to be, we're looking for the meaningful part of the meaningful use. And so the central message is that when it comes to the support of standards, they have great value, but pragmatism always has to be more important than dogmatism in the application of standards to a solution. So what I'm going to do today is make an argument based on our experience with the Auckland eReferrals under the CareConnect brand that hopefully will support that proposition. So if there's one thing I'd like to take away from this session, it is that proposition. Try to remember it. That is, if you agree with it. If you don't agree with it, well, you may need to talk to me afterwards and take it outside. So the argument that I'd like to make, in a nutshell, is we'll follow along these lines. We'll start by looking at the Auckland eReferrals project and the challenges that that project faced, and indeed the opportunities that project provided. From there, I'll be talking about the solution that the Open Health Consortium put forward and about the standards that we felt could be applied to that problem. I will spend a bit of time discussing the standards in question themselves, and I'll also look at the specifics of how those standards were designed and implemented for the Auckland eReferral solution. And I'll be doing that by answering a few key questions. I'll be asking what standard we're talking about, and as I say, taking you through some of the details, obviously only at a very high level of what that standard is. I'll be answering the question of why we decided to take this standards-based approach, and in the context of that I'll be talking about the clinical benefits that arise from the use of the standard. I'll be answering the question of how it's all gone. It's early days for the Auckland eReferrals project. It really has only just gone into pilot, so there will have to be some provisos around that, but we can start looking at it. And I'll be also talking about the lessons that we may have learned from that. My hope is that from that argument I'll be able to make the proposition that standards can help a solution that spans multiple systems like that, and that can be to the benefit of the solution, but also to the benefit of the vendors participating in the solution, and indeed to the benefit of the sector as a whole. Just a few notes before we start. I'll be making reference throughout the presentation to the standard, the HISO standard, HISO compliance. I'm well aware that HISO supports a wide range of standards, and I would encourage everyone out there to read them in detail. They're a great read. But when I say the standard or the HISO standard, I am talking specifically about HISO 10014 and the standards underneath that. I just found that saying HISO 10014.2 online forms architecture typical specification was drawing out the length of my presentation a bit much. It's easier to just refer to the standard. I'd also like to stress that this presentation is about the standard. It's not about the project as a whole. The project is fascinating, but it would make for probably a number of other presentations just to go through the details of that. So the focus is the standard, not the eReferrals project as a whole. I will just be using that project to support the arguments that I'm making in favour of the use of standards. And finally, just some clarification around my own position in this project. I come to the Auckland eReferral project relatively late in the piece, so I'm here as an interested observer, someone who's had a lot of benefit from the work that's already been done in getting these standards in place and in implementing them in the case of Auckland eReferrals. And I would draw special attention here to the various people who I would call the pioneers of the standards in question. Professor Jim Warren, who spoke so eloquently at the dinner last night, in talking about Thanksgiving, so my thanks go back to him. Also representatives from the vendors, Peter Sargent at MedTech and Ashwin Patel from my practice, who have been highly involved in the initiation of that standard, and of course HealthLink's own Ed Winning, who was one of the main authors of the standard. So that kind of gets these things out of the way, and now we'll go into the guts of the presentation and the argument that I'm trying to make in favour of standards. So let's look first at the project itself and the challenges that project faced. So in the case of the Auckland region, we're looking at 3 of New Zealand's largest DHBs in Auckland, counties Manukau and Waitemata. And across those 3 district health boards, we were looking at a yearly generation of getting close to 1 million referrals. And prior to the Auckland eReferrals project, and indeed currently until that project is extended further, those referrals were being raised manually, filled in by hand, and faxed into the district health boards. And I think you can imagine the kinds of problems that arise from that kind of situation. We were looking at lost referrals, duplicated referrals, and there was no clear single source of truth for the data that was on those referrals. So those were the problems that we were trying to address with the Auckland eReferral solution. But as well as problems, I think it's important to always recognise that any problem is also an opportunity. And the specific opportunities here were to look at the options, for taking that vision of the IT plan in terms of the sharing of information and implementing that in a real practical sense, but also an opportunity to take the work that's been done in standards and use that for clear benefit in a real project. So at this point, I'd like to introduce the Open Health Consortium, which is the group that stepped forward to take on that challenge. The Open Health Consortium is a combination of Orion with their known expertise in the secondary sector, and HealthLink with a very wide presence in the primary sector. We felt that combination would be very suitable for a solution like eReferrals that needed to span the primary and secondary sectors. And in the case of the Auckland eReferrals, the Open Health Consortium felt that the best possible solution for an online forms system like this should have standards, and in particular the HISO 10014 standards, at the very heart of the solution. So it does beg the question though, why a standard rather than just following up with online forms? And online forms are obviously the starting point for the Auckland eReferrals, but it's important to understand that there were problems, and there are problems inherent to online forms. And when you look at the documentation for the HISO standard, it does focus very much on those problems and puts itself forward as a potential resolution for those problems. And many of those problems stem from the fact that a solution like this has to span many different systems and many different vendors. And in the case of referrals, where there are, in the case of Auckland, say, in excess of 300 practices, those disparate systems involved in the solution also are highly distributed. And we felt that a standard could certainly help to address those problems. In addition to those widespread systems, it's also important to understand that the vendors of those systems were, in many cases, had serious overlapping commercial interests, and they also had significant investments into existing proprietary interfaces. So the standard provided a way in which those competing interests could potentially be overcome. And standards address this problem by basically defining some neutral territory for the interfaces between systems. They facilitate interoperability with neutral interfaces. By neutral interfaces in that context, I'm talking about technology neutral, independent of the specific technologies on which a vendor solution has been implemented. Standards also overcome these problems by being independent of the individual commercial and technical interests of the vendors that are participating in the solution. And overall, the governance mechanisms that necessarily underpin standards provide similar neutral territory in which the arbitration of disputes can take place in a neutral environment rather than as a head-to-head between competing vendors. So, when I'm talking about the standard, online forms are great, but we need standards to overcome those fundamental problems. And looking at the standard, it does specifically set out to address those kinds of problems. I'm going to list just 6 key points that the standard itself identifies as its own goals, and I'm paraphrasing the HISO document in describing these, but I think it will be possible to link these goals to the goal is to overcome problems, and I'm going to list 6 problems that have been identified there. One is the problem of multiple disparate coding systems. I'm sure that there are people in the room who are familiar with the problems associated with inconsistent coding systems across solutions. Another problem that the standard proposes to solve is that of hard-coded business rules, where the business rules are inherent to the solution or the particular system put up by the vendor rather than generic. There are also data quality issues. There is a high cost of change to these proprietary interfaces, and the corollary to that is, of course, there's a low pace of change. It can take a while. And finally, because the systems are inflexible in that way, there's often the opportunity for rogue forms to emerge that bypass the subscribing systems. So these are all problems that the HISO standard itself puts itself forward to resolve, and we felt that they could be applied in the case of the Auckland eReferrals. The standard identifies a number of systems participating in an online form solution, and the key ones to be aware of are the user application. In this case, the user application is going to be the practice management system at the practice, or an EMR at another site. And there are a number of components that are associated with supplying that form itself. So we have a forms manager, which is responsible for the distribution of forms, maintaining that central repository of forms that will be available at the practice. We have the forms engine that manages the specific instantiation of an individual form and the interactions between that form and the user application. And the submission gateway that is responsible for routing the form from the site of practice through to its eventual recipient. I would also mention that the standard identifies a number of other systems, such as publication and distribution systems, but it does specifically note that those are out of scope for the standard. So our focus is very much on these components, and in particular on the interactions between that user application, the EMR, and the forms engine, which is handling the specific instance of the form in the case of an individual e-referral. So taking those core components and seeing how they were implemented in the case of Auckland e-referrals, I draw your attention to this diagram. So what we see here is on the left-hand side, we see the components that are deployed at an individual site or practice, and on the right-hand side, those components that are run centrally. So, and what I've done is I've also taken the practice management system, or the EMR, and split that out into relevant components that are important for the solution. So, at the top left, you'll see the core EMR functionality itself, and that's supported by a database. The standard makes reference to a forms viewer. In this case, we've used an embedded browser within both of the participating vendors' practice management systems. That's a way of surfacing the forms. And then the new components that have had to be introduced within the EMR, we're looking at a HISO service, which is a web service that complies to the standard. and a concept resolution engine, which takes the requests that are in those forms and responds to them with the native data that comes from the core EMR itself. So that's within the EMR. Below that, you'll see the components that are operating locally within the practice, but are form-specific components. And so there you see the forms engine and the submission gateway. And those are both, as I say, the forms engine handling the individual forms, and the submission gateway responsible for route. And then centrally, you'll see the forms manager supplying the template forms, and the submission route itself going through to the eventual recipient. And so I bring your attention now to a variation on that diagram that actually shows the specific process. I'll go through it as quickly as I can. If you do have questions around the process, because it is quite detailed, do feel free to talk to me afterwards. But what you see is up in the top left-hand corner, within the scope of the core EMR, a new form gets initiated in a patient context. And it's very important to understand that that patient context is critical to the online form. The first thing that takes place is that the core EMR calls its HISO service and gets that service initiated with that patient context. And that HISO service returns a session ID that identifies that patient context. And that ensures that we can have a shared session between the EMR and the form components. The forms viewer is then instantiated, and that's, as I say, an embedded browser. It's a straightforward HTTP call and URL, if you like, to the forms engine, and it passes through that session ID and also the callback URL for the HISO service itself. The forms engine then goes off to the forms manager, central service, and pulls down the latest version of that form, and it uses the HISO service to start pre-populating the data that's required for the form. So the HISO service then calls on the concept resolution engine, calls the database, we get the relevant data back, and it's returned via the HISO service as concepts that conform to the data concepts that have been identified in the standard and that are specifically in use in the case of this form. That form is then rendered in the forms viewer, fully pre-populated and ready for submission. Now there are the potential at that stage for a number of further calls to the HISO service. For example, in the form you might be presented with a list of attachments, a list of lab results, and you want to drill down and get the specifics of those, in which case you'll identify the specific labs or attachments that you're interested in. There'll be further calls to the HISO service so that it can again in turn interrogate the EMR, pull back the details and populate those into the form. Perhaps more importantly, the standard also supports the parking and reopening of the form, again through that same HISO interface. So the web service includes operations that support that parking and reopening. But ultimately, at the end of it, there will be a point in which the clinician can say, this form is now complete and I'm ready to submit. The form then gets submitted, passed to the forms engine. Validation is carried out on that form. Some part of it being devolved out to the form manager so that it's taking place through your server side. And in turn it gets routed via web services to the local submission gateway. That local submission gateway has encryption capabilities, so it encrypts the payload, and the complete form is submitted through to the inbound referral gateway in the central services, again by way of web services. And finally, that inbound gateway sends it through a route. The route might involve some form of translation, for example, from XML to HL7, and that in turn passes it all the way via web services to the ultimate recipient. That recipient is required to return an ACK or a NAC indicating the successful failure of that transmission, and that makes its way all the way back through all of these same systems, ultimately arriving at the forms engine where it can be presented as a message within the forms viewer to say, yes, your referral went through, or no, it didn't, and take appropriate action in the case that it didn't. So standards are key in this process in terms of both identifying the components, but perhaps most importantly in that interface between the forms engine and the HISO service that is put up by the EMR. And there are a number of operations that support that. I won't go into detail, but I do have that information available if anyone wants to talk about it. It's something I can talk about a lot because I've been involved with it in a lot in recent months. So that's the standard and the details of how it's been implemented for Auckland eReferral. But there's got to be a reason why we've chosen to implement the solution using these standards. And that reason has to derive back to clinical benefits. And in order to make the case for the clinical benefits of the standard, I think I first need to make a case for the clinical benefits of online forms themselves. So what I've drawn up here is just a quick contrast between the advantages or potential advantages of online forms versus the manual forms that were being used previously. So your online forms are machine readable. This means that the data that gets pre-populated or gets entered in by the clinician can make their way undiluted and untranslated or retranscribed into recipient systems. There's no process of opening them up and retyping them. They can be pre-populated. That's critical to the success of an e-referral. It means that it's a seamless experience for the clinician. They're consistent across EMRs. They're always up to date. In online forms, there's the option for interactive assistance with completion of the form. So online help or context-based help is all available. Online forms can be audited and reported on, and they're not readily falsifiable. When we pass those forms through, there's a signature that goes with them that clearly identifies where they came from. There are definitely some advantages to the manual approach. It's a very, there are no barriers to participation in a manual form. All you need is paper and access to the postal service or a fax. So they're very easily used, and they're pretty robust. They're not subject to any kind of failure if there's a power outage, a network outage, anything like that. But overall, I think the argument can certainly be made that online forms are superior to manual forms. But that's just forms. The case that I'm trying to make here is in favour of standards. So, looking at standards, how do they facilitate forms? Well, I'd like to remind you, I guess, of those problems that with online forms that we talked about in relation to the standard. And I think, in the context of e-referrals, what the standards bring to the solution is that they allow us to give a seamless experience to the clinician that's completing that referral. The referral fits nicely within their existing business process. It gets surfaced within the EMR that is their normal place of business. It is initiated directly from that patient context where they're already going to be working. And the form supports that by allowing tight integration in terms of the user interface and the user experience, getting that Form 0 right within the user application, but loose coupling at the data level. So those exchanges between the EMR system and the forms engine can be done with any compliant EMR system. So we have that loose coupling. And it's that combination of tight user experience and loose data coupling that give us that allow that form to fit seamlessly within the clinician's existing business process. And I guess the data concepts are also another clear place in which the standards benefit that interaction. So I'd like to talk very quickly about some aspects of our design and implementation. I've split the table there into two sections. The design section that was all about true collaboration, very much a round table process in which the parties involved in the solution and indeed in the standard came together, and there was a very much a focus on working together to achieve consensus around both the operations of the standard, but also, and perhaps more importantly, around the data concepts, because that's where the greatest potential for dispute arose. And I was talking earlier about pragmatism and the importance of that within the scope of the standard, and this is a case where that certainly applies. So in many cases, what we've had to do within the referrals is really boil things down to just the most important data concepts and get agreement on those, what we call the priority one concepts within the scope of the solution. When we move from design to implementation, of necessity, that truly roundtable and collaborative approach needs to subside. We need to move, basically the participating vendors need to do their own parts individually. HealthLink involved on the form side, and the vendors, MyPractice and MedTech, working on their own solutions. But even in that context, we still facilitated the progress of the solution by putting forward a number of appropriate documents and tools. We had data concept spreadsheets that were continually doing the rounds to get the details of those concepts. An implementation guide so that HealthLink were able to put up our view of what we thought an implementation of the solution would be like, and as an assistance to the vendors to help them get that solution in place. There was a vendor validation tool. This was a preliminary form that was available in which a vendor could test their compliance against the standard in a very versatile way, testing all of the different ways in which they could interact with the form, and also just talking to each other, just mutual support between the participating vendors. Sorry, getting there. So looking just at how this has all gone, an evaluation of the solution. As I said, it's very early days, but I think there are a lot of encouraging signs that that this has gone well. And I draw your attention to a few in particular. We've already deployed 2 further forms on the same platform, and although there was a long lead time on the initial solution, those additional forms have been deployed in a matter of weeks. They've been very quick to put in place. We've got 2 major players within the health sector already looking at getting solutions based on this same platform or their own variations of this platform. And the next phase of this e-referral solution is also under active consideration right now. HealthLink are looking at bringing a number of our existing proprietary solutions into line with the HISO standard, and the vendors themselves expressed a keenness to make the most of the investment that they've already made in this standard. So, and then finally we've got additional vendors expressing great interest in bringing their solutions online with the standard. In terms of the lessons learned, the vendor buy-in is critical. The governance was important to making sure that the standard was widely accepted by all who were participating in it. The data concepts, as I said before, are definitely key to the solution. But going forward, we have identified that more formal systems are needed. Because this was the first cab off the rank with the standard, it was possible to do things in a fairly ad hoc way when necessary. But now that there are production, real-life systems using the standard, we need to formalise those approaches. So just summarising, we think standards are great because of because of the arguments that are put forward already, but we also feel that they prevent they prevent rip and replace of solutions and instead focus on integration. They're highly extensible and reusable. Solutions based on standards promote participation. They allow more vendors to participate in the solution based on compliance with the standard rather than arbitrary proprietary interfaces. They level the playing field, so monopoly players are at no greater advantage than new entrants. And they are technology neutral, so they allow us to provide solutions that span multiple technologies. So again, I'd reiterate that our lessons from the Auckland eReferrals is that a standards-based solution is definitely an effective way of providing cross-vendor integration, as long as you're pragmatic and realistic about how you do it. I think that's me done. I have a question, but I know that I've kind of gone over, so